Representative Hudson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Representative Lesnikar. I want to start off by just acknowledging the fact that even by me flipping that switch on so that people can actually hear me, to speak to this particular issue is triggering for some folks simply because my views on this underlying issue have been very clearly articulated in the past. I want to try to push us past all of that. I want to try to kind of detangle the issues that are apparent but not being communicated clearly that impact women's athletics. It's very curious to me that we've heard multiple times, and I did not expect this when I woke up this morning, we've heard multiple times today that the idea that women generally can't do what men do generally, specifically in this area of women's athletics, is wrong. That's a wrong idea, which seems to be a direct refutation of the intent and purpose of Title IX. That's bizarre to me. Like, we shouldn't have sex divisions in sports? That's the implication of that statement, that sentiment, that women's athletics categorically shouldn't exist. I find that very, very bizarre. And I think at issue here is that we're failing. Representative Finke made the point about calling trans girls boys, and that is somehow dehumanizing.
Representative Hudson, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The problem here is that we are using the same terms across two different categories. Men, women, boys, girls. We all use those words, but we're not all talking about the same thing. And we all know it. It is embedded in the language that you use. Terms like cisgender, transgender, trans girls, trans boys, gender affirming, cisnormative. All of these terms acknowledge a distinction. We all understand that we clearly agree that there are at least two categories that we're talking about that have meaningful distinctions. If that wasn't true, we wouldn't need any of these terms, right? So what is it that we're talking about? What are these distinct categories? Well, let's start with the fact that sex has been a protected class in the Minnesota Human Rights Act since 1967. The purpose of protecting biological sex from discrimination was to ensure that members of the female sex could access the same rights and privileges as members of the male sex. That's why we did it. In 1967, the concept that we talk about today as gender identity was less than a decade old. It had not been broadly accepted. There's a doctor from Johns Hopkins University, his name was John Money. He was a psychologist there, and he first coined this term, gender identity. That was in 1955. So it's no surprise then that that concept was acknowledged in the Minnesota Human Rights Act when it was first enacted in 1967. So for over 50 years, the law remained silent on this new concept of gender identity. It wasn't until last year in 2024 that we decided to include this new category in our anti-discrimination provisions. This is significant. And by the way, it's not my claim that gender identity is a distinct category from biological sex. This is something that the originators and even modern propagators of this idea continue to make that distinction. John Money said that the term gender role is used to signify all those things that a person says or does to disclose themselves as having the status of a boy or a man, a girl or a woman. Similarly, Judith Butler, who was a leading figure in gender theory, expanded on his distinction in a book she wrote called Gender Trouble. She wrote, quote, "There is no gender identity behind the expressions of gender. That identity is performatively constituted by the very expressions that are said to be its results." It's a performance. That's the distinction. So when we use these terms in these two different categories, we are talking about two very distinct things. The distinction between the male sex and the female sex is a biological physical reality that has real-world physical implications the idea that in order to affirm somebody's performance, we have to allow a member of the male sex to check a member of the female sex on a basketball court, watch her collapse, watch the basketball fall back down on her, hit her, and then watch her cry on the court for the next 10 minutes, that's what we have to do in order to affirm this novel concept of gender identity that is not an acceptable status quo. It was said earlier that this conflict, which I appreciate the fact that you're even acknowledging there is a conflict, this conflict was created by politicians damn straight last year, 2024, when you put into the Minnesota Human Rights Act a category that directly conflicts with a pre-existing category. It is impossible to protect both of these things. You cannot protect the distinction between the male sex and the female sex while also protecting somebody's identity and expression to the contrary of that existing category. Thank you, Madam Chair. I think I've made my point.